For all of the inferential statistical tests that we talk about in this class, there are three kinds of hypotheses that we're going to be using, and that you're going to need to know how they differ from one another and how to use them. So the first one is called a research hypothesis. And this is a tentative, untested. You don't know this whether it's true or not. A tentative, conceptual explanation. You are testing with your research. And so this is the kind of hypothesis that you'll come across when you read a research article. An example of this might be something that is like caffeine increases alertness, right? So this is just in regular English. This is just a conceptual explanation of a causal variable, an effect variable, and how the cause results in an effect. So if you drink caffeine, you're going to end up being more alert, right? So that is an example of a research hypothesis. The second kind of hypothesis that we're going to be regularly using is called a null hypothesis. And this is a mathematical statement about what the population is like if your research hypothesis is wrong. So for example, you would write it H sub 0, it's also called H sub naught, colon. And for this research hypothesis, what we'd end up with is, let's say we do an experiment where some people get caffeinated coffee and other people get decaffeinated coffee, and we measure their alertness. So here, the null hypothesis would say that the average alertness for the caffeine group would be exactly the same as the average alertness of the decaffeinated group. Notice a few things here. First off, these are population parameters. We're going to collect data with samples, and then we're going to use our inferential statistics to test this hypothesis that's about the population, right? And this is a conceptual description. This is a mathematical description. And this is going to be a central feature of how we actually test the hypothesis for all of the inferential tests that we do. And also notice that I set these as being equal, even though the hypothesis here said caffeine increases alertness. The null hypothesis almost always is just going to say that these are identical, rather than one is greater than or less than the other. And the third kind of hypothesis is called the alternative hypothesis. And this is like the null hypothesis, but it's the complement of it. So this is a mathematical statement about the population if the null hypothesis is wrong. And the alternative hypothesis is going to have within it your research hypothesis. So an example of an alternative hypothesis would be something like H sub A for alternative, or you could have H sub 1 if you want. It's always a 0 for the null hypothesis, but for the alternative hypothesis, sometimes you'll see a a 1 or sometimes an A. And now we're going to have the exact same means in here. But now they're going to be unequal. So these could be unequal such that the caffeinated group has more alertness than the decaf, or the decaf has more alertness than the caffeinated. What critically matters is that this says there's no difference, and this includes everything that's not in here. And when you're doing research, this is what you'll develop first based on your understanding of the literature or your intuition about how the world works. And so you'll come up with a research question that you're trying to test, and then you'll formulate that as your research hypothesis. And this would go in your research paper that you're writing. Then when you actually do the statistics, behind the scenes, not in your paper, that's when you're going to care about the null hypothesis and the alternative hypotheses. These won't go in your research paper, but these are going to be a central feature in how we do all of the inferential tests that we do in this class. And in particular, this null hypothesis is a super important feature because by setting these as being equal, that allows us to calculate probabilities later on about whether or not the observed difference between two groups is what you'd expect if this is true versus if it's not true. And that'll be something we'll focus on for the rest of the class. And one last thing I wanted to mention is a mnemonic, a way to remember that the null hypothesis says that they're the same. And the mnemonic is the null hypothesis is the dull hypothesis. And right, null and dull rhyme, but the reason it's the dull hypothesis is for all of the tests that we're going to do all semester, the null hypothesis says that there's nothing happening, that there's no difference, that there's no association, there's just nothing happening in the world, and that's a dull state of affairs. So the null hypothesis is the dull hypothesis throughout the whole class.